You may recognise Kurt Zouma as a West Ham United professional footballer, or you may have only lately come across the name owing to an upsetting footage of the sportsman demonstrating aggression by kicking his cat. It could be argued that the player applied the violent behaviour he had learned on the football field outside of the sport. This vlog will discuss whether sports violence leads to further violence outside the game for sports athletes. The main point that will be highlighted to explore this argument is: what is sports violence? How is violence in sports acceptable despite unacceptable outside the sport? And the theories to support and discredit how sports violence leads to violence outside the sport. An organised competitive physical activity is referred to as sports, such as rugby and netball. They provide benefits such as teamwork, fitness and passion for the participants. However, violence is a problematic element within sport, which comes in various forms from threatening words to physical assault and murder. Sports violence is defined as physical contact that involves excessive or needless force outside of the rules of the sport in order to inflict injury. This definition emphasises sports violence as illegal and criminal sports action. However, violence is a typical occurrence in sports, as All 2020 emphasises that violence in some sports is acceptable and expected behaviour when governed by laws, such as rugby tackle. Although when excessive or illegitimate force is used, penalties are enforced, such as a yellow card. As a result, sports violence may be viewed within a broad concept that encompasses a variety of forms and opinion on what constitutes appropriate violence in sports. These violent acts, such as a punch, slap, kick, or even a few bone breaks, are acceptable within sport. However, if these acts occurred outside of the game and on the streets, it would be viewed as assault. Therefore, what enables these behaviours to be encouraged and condoned within sports but prosecuted within society? Physical contact is inevitable in contact sports, as is part of the game. For example, football, where tackling is a key element. Consent is used as a defence for sports violence, as in the case of Avi Brown. You can consent to violence being inflicted within the sport, as the athletes understand the force will be inflicted upon themselves, which could lead to injury. Therefore, by agreeing to play the sport, the athletes are implying consent and relinquishing their rights to remain free from bodily harm. The Avi Brown case also enabled acts which exceed the laws surrounding the sport to be challenged in the court, such as a punch below the belt in boxing. This could be seen as a form of maintaining the violence in the sport at an acceptable level. However, most of the violence we witness in sports has little to do with the game's objective, yet still considered part of the game. This was recognised in the Avi Bradshaw case, which found that contact that occurred outside of the game's rule but within the usual practice may be regarded as consensual. This is referred to as playing culture, which is the way in which the participants are expected to play the game. Because there is no benefit to the game, this might be viewed as encouraging violence among athletes outside of sports. Culture could also provide a source to the acceptance of violence within and outside the rules of sports. Culture is defined as a collective view or way of life of members of society which is evolving and as is being passed on from generation to generation. Violent sports have been a significant part of culture throughout the world for generations, dating back further than historians will ever know, with the fighting the gladiators in the arena in 264 BCE, with spectators encouraging killing of one another, to today, fans cheering as men punch each other in a boxing ring. This shows as sports has developed and changed over time, a similar feature which remains unchanged is the violent aspect of the game. Doherty 2001 argues the reasoning for this is that violence has been the prime feature for the success of these sports due to be viewed as entertainment within the sporting context. Snyder 2009 notes violence in sports is encouraged by society as is demonstrated by their attendance to the game. In addition, violent sports were seen to be more popular within society, with football continuously being the most viewed sport. Therefore, as violence is culturally accepted, the high exposure to sports violence and the fluidity of consent and laws surrounding sports violence, does this lead to enhancing violence within society? This section will look at athletes' violence outside the sport and the theoretical explanation for violence outside sports. Men who participate in violent sports are shown to have greater levels of aggression, both within and outside the activity. The cause of this violence, according to Hudson 2020, is that contact sports require athletes to be aggressive and tough, and this violent attitude follows them off the field, leading to violent crimes. This implies that sports violence is not confined, and as a result, violence in sports generates violence outside the sport. The case of Raymond Anthony Lewis, a football linebacker who got into a fight resulting in stabbing and murdering his victim, is an example of a high-profile case of an athlete exhibiting violence outside of the game. Although this example demonstrates athletes' violence outside the sport, the form of violence of stabbing is a heightened level of aggression from what the sport would be requiring. Therefore, despite the athlete demonstrating violence, it could be an outcome from another source than rugby. Therefore, it is unclear whether participation in violent sports causes violence outside the sports. Smith discovered athletes in contact sports are more violent than athletes in non-contact sports. This is a result of contact sport athletes being more accepting of violence as they participate in sports which causes harm to other athletes, suggesting violent sport athletes are more violent as they perceive violence as a normal element within their life. In addition, it was discovered at all ages, from club to professional level within sport, all athletes demonstrated a high level of violence, insinuating regardless of age and professionalism, violence in sport enhances athlete violence. However, this is not accurate in the context of female sports athletes, as they demonstrated lower levels of aggression in contrast to non-athletes. This suggests that the violence in sports does not affect gender equally, as it is more influential among men than women. The most reported crimes committed by athletes are domestic violence and sexual assault. These two crimes are seen as violent crimes which could be a result of the learned violence within the athlete's sport. Forbes 2006 strengthens this point by discovering that research discovered that athletes in aggressive high school sports were most likely to be involved in relationship violence. The volume of sexual and domestic violence against women by athletes could be attributed to the rape culture within sports. Rape culture is the belief that encourages male sexual violence against women. McRae 2020 strengthens this point by stating that rape culture is learnt in sports. This is due to sports culture promotion of masculine privilege, as well as a tolerance for rationalising rape, which are elements that support rape culture. However, the increased level of sexual assault among athletes could be credited to the fluidity of consent that they have learned within sports. As mentioned previously, sports consent to violent force is extensive, covering a wide range of behaviours which is seen as acceptable behaviour. New 2016 reinforces this perspective by noting the lack of education surrounding sexual consent amongst athletes is a factor resulting in athletes perpetrating sexual assault. In addition, a survey discovered male athletes, in contrast to non-athletes, misunderstood the concept of consent, with 2/3 stating unless it's an absolute no, it's okay to engage in sexual acts, suggesting the components which legitimises violence within sports, such as consent and culture, can lead to misinterpretation of legitimate and illegitimate violence within society as a result of the flexibility of these components within the sport. By considering the statistics and research provided, it can be argued that the violence in sports leads to violence in athletes outside the sport. This section will discuss the theoretical underpinnings of why theorists believe sports violence leads to violence outside the sport. The theories this vlog will discuss is social learning theory and masculinity theory. A theory which can explain the sports violence leads to further violence outside the sports can be seen in the social learning theory proposed by Albert Bandura. According to this theory, individuals learn violent behaviour by observing and imitating their social environment. Oprica 2013 notes, "We imitate behaviour after considering the consequences of the actions. Therefore, actions which have positive effects are imitated to achieve the same desired results." The benefits of violence can be seen in sport, where violence in sports such as a rugby tackle receives the positive response of praise from teammates, coaches and spectators. Snyder 2009 furthers this point, stating, "The learned violence in sports leads athletes to believe that violence is acceptable to achieving benefits outside the sports." This theory explains the discrepancies among athletes of contact sports in contrast to non-athletes and athletes not in contact sports, as they have a higher exposure to violence. However, this theory has limitations, as Whitley 2008 notes, individuals have prior violent tendencies before their exposure to viewing violence in sports, suggesting that other factors other than sports violence can contribute to violence outside the sport, such as childhood experiences of violence. In addition, not all athletes engage in violent acts outside the sport, meaning the theory of observation of violence leads to imitation of violence is not as straightforward as it may seem, as athletes are affected differently from observing violence. The masculinity theory provides another explanation for sportsmen's increased violence outside of sports. Male athletes, as previously stated, have a larger risk of participating in violent behaviour than female athletes. Masculinity refers to a man's role and expected behaviour within society. Violence can be linked to masculinity, as masculine gender norms are for men to be aggressive, strong and dominant over women. Thus, men use violence to express their masculinity, since a masculine identity is connected with a greater social position, financial gain and power. Sport enables men to develop their masculine identity through exhibiting aggression, power and strength. Insinuating male athletes commit violence as a result of masculine gender norms and sports expectations for them to be violent, along with the benefits associated to having a masculine identity. Pesero notes, the reasoning behind why violence is not contained within sports is due to athletes connecting the violence within sports with the benefits of the masculine identity leading to off-field violence. The masculinity theory may also explain why sexual and domestic violence are the most common forms of violence perpetrated by sportsmen. As previously said, domination over women is an important aspect of masculine identity. Hence, sexual and domestic violence may be a way for athletes to demonstrate their masculinity by dominating females. Sexual violence is more widespread in society that encourages male dominance over female inferiority and is used to control and dominate their victims. This may be traced back to the sports rape culture, which encourages male superiority over females. Thus, this theory encourages the notion that sports violence beggars violence, as the masculine identity linked to the sports leads men to believe they can further their identity outside the sports by demonstrating violence. This concept has flaws, since it focuses on social influences in contrast to biological elements determined by male behaviour. It could be argued that societal gender norms are not the cause of male violence, in the case of Laura Jessica, a transgender athletic runner who stabbed her coach 51 times with a knife. Because Laura was not conforming to the masculine but the feminine expectations of society, the violence could be a result of Laura's biological makeup. Furthermore, as illustrated by Hannah Bluck, a Welsh international rugby player who assaulted her fiancé by punching her in the face, this concept ignores the reality that female athletes are violent. Thus, more research is required to understand the difference in violence between men and women, in particular research on female violence, as it is scarce. Abraham 2015 argues athletes and non-athlete levels of violence are not different as a result of sports. Sports has been stated to reduce the level of violence in athletes, with sports being referred to as a tool for peace for athletes. Sports has been used as a crime prevention method, where they're proven to be an effective deterrent by reducing violent crimes by 0.97 to 1.56%. Although the decrease in violent crimes are minimal, it strengthens the argument that sports reduces violent behaviour in contrast to enhancing it. A theoretical explanation for the reduction of violence as a result of sports can be seen in the catharsis theory. Catharsis is referred as a healthy and acceptable way of releasing pent-up frustration to provide relief. According to this theory, violence is a normal instinct in human beings that requires to be released. Thus, by releasing aggression in a controlled amount, it decreases violent outbursts. Johnson 2014 highlights the catharsis nature of sports by enabling athletes to encounter high emotional experiences and emotional releases through their participation. Insinuated levels of violence amongst athletes should be lower in contrast to the general public, as they have been able to release their aggression. However, Cannes 2019 research contradicts this theory, presenting no discrepancies in results among athletes and non-athletes' level of violence, although the representation and accuracy of these results could be questioned, as the sample was small, only consisting of 100 participants from Pakistan, which could mean these results cannot be generalised to the global population to explain sports violence in different cultural and social backgrounds. Anderson 2005 notes further research is required to support this theory, as there is a lack of empirical support surrounding it. To conclude, determining whether violence in sports leads to further violence outside the sport in athletes can be seen as a complex matter, as there is different viewpoints and research which contradicts each other. The majority of research suggests that male athletes of contact sports are influenced greatly by sports violence, and females as the least effective. However, sport is also viewed as a crime prevention method that provides relief. Therefore, more research is required to fully understand whether sports violence leads to further violence, although it could be viewed that the likelihood of athletes engaging in violence determines on a range of additional external and internal factors than merely the component of participating in violent sports.